Alright guys, welcome back for another video of HAIKYU Fly High. And this one, I know a lot of people have been waiting for this, which is going to be a build guide for SP Tsuki. It took me a while to get this video out purely because one, it's actually quite complicated to build. Two, I also wanted to wait for SP Kuro to be out so that I can actually test him alongside with Tsuki as well. Okay, so let me just quickly talk about how you may actually want to build him, and then I'll move on to the potential. So basically, there are essentially, I guess you can say there are almost like 4 different ways of how you can build Tsuki, because you can build his potential geared toward either quick spike or defense, and also at the same time, depending on whether you have attack technique versus defense technique, he can also be into either attack state or defense state. Okay, so essentially that's going to be 4 different combinations. The state can be either attack or defense, and the potential can be attack or defense. They don't have to align with each other. For example, I can have attack state, but with a defensively built potential on my Tsuki. So that's kind of why there are going to be 4 different combinations. If your Tsuki is going to be less than, I'm just going to say less than skill resistance 4, I personally would recommend that you focus only on one type of build, which is going to be aligning your attack state with attack potential or defense state versus defense potential. Okay, so basically you want to make sure they actually align. Once you actually have your Tsuki at skill resistance 4, you can then actually mix it up. For example, you can actually have an attack state Tsuki with defense build potential and vice versa. The reason why I'm going to say this is that, to be honest, if you actually take a look at this, the level on his skill 3, at base level, you're actually going to get hit by quite a big reduction in your multiplier. It's 100% reduction in the multiplier for the other stats, and that's kind of why I feel like it's quite bigger hit at low level. Whereas if you actually have a high skill resistance, what that basically means is very likely your skill 3 is going to be highly leveled up, and also your block and also your spike ultimate would also be sufficiently high enough so that even if you do actually take a bit of a hit, because the natural multiplier, the base multiplier is already quite high, you are actually able to have Tsuki performing both roles, and that's where you can then add in all kind of crazy combinations. But until you actually have, let's say, his skill resistance 3 and potentially also his block and ultimate skill level higher, otherwise I feel like at base level, so only at, let's say, skill resistance 1, Tsuki is more versatile in the sense that he can choose to either go for defense or attack. However, he can't do both roles at the same time. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing you guys have to bear in mind. Okay, now let's talk about how to then decide whether you want your Tsuki to be attack state or defense state. So the way it's going to be determined is going to be whether your attack technique versus defense technique, which one's going to be higher. Now, this condition check is actually done at the start of the match. This is kind of the reason why I wanted to wait for SP Kuro to be out. So basically, I've tested with this team composition. And if you actually take a look at this, my Kuro should have given 17% attack technique to my whole team because he's in the front row. However, if you take a look at my Tsuki starts off with a 16% defense technique. So if Kuro's attack technique is actually added, theoretically I should have higher attack technique than defense technique, and that will make him into attack state. But in reality, that's not the case. In reality, this is still considered as a defense state, and that basically means that when you actually take a look at skill 3, when it says unmatched start, that is a higher priority than any kind of passive, which doesn't mention that wording. Okay, so even though Kuro's one just says when he's in the front row or when he's on the court, that is determined to be at a lower timing than what's considered at start of match. Okay, so basically what that means is that in order to make sure your Tsuki is either having higher attack technique or lower defense technique, just to make sure you guys either going to attack or defense state, you can ignore anyone else on your team. It's initially just going to be focused on the potential build on Tsuki himself, and vast majority of the time it's just going to be determined by the potential on his slot 6. Okay, the reason why it's mostly just going to be determined by the potential on slot 6 is that if you actually take a look at on slot 6, you are going to get a 15% base on either attack technique or defense technique, provided you have that main stat. Whereas for all of the other substats, normally you only get, like, I think the base level is only 1.2%. So in order for your other substat to add up to be more than the main stat, it's going to be ridiculously hard. So vast majority of the time you can quite easily make sure your Tsuki is either attack state or defense state, but simply making sure you have the right main stats on your slot 6 potential. Okay, now How do you actually want to decide whether or not your Tsuki is going to be attack versus defense state then? So it's normally going to be quite simple if you already know what team composition you're going to have, okay? So basically there's going to be two scenarios. One is that you already know exactly who are going to be your 7 members of the team, and you just need to figure out what's your Tsuki's role. And then the second scenario is going to be you have a free choice of building Tsuki however you want, and then you make up the rest of the team in order to make sure Tsuki shines in that composition. So the two situations slightly different. The second one is a bit more tricky, but in the first scenario, where let's say you already know who exactly is going to be your 7 members of the team, it's going to be extremely straightforward for you to figure out what role Tsuki should be doing. And the reason for this is because whenever obviously on the court there should only be 6 players. One player would normally be subbed off by your liberal, one player is normally going to be a setter, and then one player would be up front to do the block, and that basically leaves the last 3 remaining character to be spiking role. Okay, so as you can see, once you already know who are your 7 characters on the team, the role each one of them need to do is going to be extremely straightforward, because once you have excluded your liberal and also your setter, then out of the remaining 4 positions, you need exactly 1 blocker and 3 spiker. So depending on who are going to be the other 3 characters on your team, it's going to be extremely easy to figure out whether Tsuki needs to be of that blocking role versus that spiking role. Okay. And now let's consider the second situation, which is you don't know the whole 7 members of your team. So, for example, you might know you definitely want to play, let's say, Kenma, Kuro, and Hinata because they have great synergy and bond with Tsuki, but you don't really know the rest of your team member, and therefore you do have a bit of flexibility of choosing whether to build Tsuki in attack versus defend, and then choose the remaining member accordingly to adapt. Then in those kind of cases, you need to figure out what's going to be the main advantage, so pro and con of his attack state versus defense state. So if we take a look at what does attack or defense state even mean, you know it kind of impacts the way he plays in 3 different ways. Number 1 is that you'll be reducing one stat whilst buffing up the other stat. This is purely a numerical number change. It's not really going to change the way you are going to build a team, so I'm just going to ignore this, take this out of consideration. Then the second thing attack versus defense state is going to impact is that you will be reducing the cooldown. Now this is for me actually going to be quite important, because it could potentially mean that you may not have to bring 3 spikers, or you don't have to bring as many blockers, etc. So this can potentially change the way you are going to affect your team composition, so you do want to bear that in mind. Okay, so reducing cooldown for me is quite important. And then the third thing, which is going to be quite important, is that when you actually perform that action, your crit rate is going to be buffed up depending on the crit rate of the other action. Okay, so basically if you're doing a quick spike in attack state, your awareness will go up based on reflex, and in defense state when you're doing block, your reflex will increase based on awareness. Once again, this can also be very important because you do actually want to go for crit as often and as consistently as possible, and this can potentially then change your team composition because you may not actually need to bring buffers who will buff up your attack, who will buff up your awareness or your reflex, etc. Okay, so when deciding on whether or not you want to go for attack versus defense state, the main thing that I think you guys need to consider is going to be the reduction in cooldown and also increase of that crit rate for either awareness or reflex. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go through them one by one. So first of all, reducing cooldown. To me, first of all, I personally think the reducing of cooldown in defense state is not going to be that important, because what happens is normally your spike has a cooldown of 8. However, once you actually go into defense state, you will be reducing the cooldown by extra 2, and that becomes a cooldown of 6 net crossing. The reason why I say this is not that important, at least as of right now, is the fact that normally what you end up doing is that you just have 3 spikers, and normally each one of those spikers have a cooldown of 8 net crossing, and that's normally going to be fine, because unless you actually have one single rally drag out for more than 6 net crossing, otherwise normally 2 of your net crossing will be based on a surf rather than based on spike. So that's kind of why a lot of times 3 spike is actually going to be enough for you to rotate around all of the spiking rotation, even though they're 8 net crossing rather than 6 net crossing. So even if you do actually reduce attack cooldown from 8 net crossing down to 6 net crossing, it's not really going to change the way you're going to build your team, because at the end of the day, you're still going to need 3 spikers. And it's also somewhat similar for in attack state as well, because you will be reducing your block system cooldown from 12 net crossing down to 8 net crossing. Now this will make you, I guess, in some sense, it will slightly be a bit more beneficial because even though you may be the only blocker, you will at least be using your ult more frequently. But from team composition point of view, it's not going to change. It's not saying that, for example, if you reduce from 12 net crossing down to 8 net crossing, you will suddenly be able to use only one blocker rather than two blocker, etc. It's not really going to change how many blocker you're going to bring onto your team. So from team composition point of view, I don't think either of those cooldown reduction really matters that much. But if we are talking about from raw power point of view, I do feel like attack state have a slight edge here because reducing the block cooldown would essentially mean that you will be able to use your block ultimate a bit more frequently, and therefore, for example, the trigger this effect of actually buffing up your reflex stats and spirit for people in your back row. That can be very useful, especially when you use this in alongside with SP Crow. When SP Crow is at the back, remember his reflex and spirit will actually be buffed up by others in the same row. So when you actually have something which buff up the entire back row's reflex and spirit, that value is essentially going to be doubled on Crow. So that's kind of why this is very good when you actually use it in consideration with Crow. Whereas for if you actually do it in defense state and reducing the attack cooldown, this pretty much makes no difference at all because you will still be rotating your spike ultimate between those three spikers. You would never be really using them for like a normal spike without an ultimate anyway. So that's kind of why, with all things considered, I personally think like attack state is slightly better than defense state from the cooldown reduction point of view. Now that is considered just of right now. However, in the future, when there are more better character or better support for Tsuki, this will actually change slightly differently. Because in the future, we're actually going to get SP Hiragami, who has the ability to reduce both Tsuki's attack or spike ultimate and also defense ultimate cooldown by 4. And what that essentially means is that you would only start off with a cooldown of 8 for his block and a cooldown of 4 for his spike. And then in those kind of cases, let's say if you actually do a block state or defense state, you can then reduce this by further 2, and that actually makes his spike ultimate only have a cooldown of 2. And in those cases, that would actually impact your team composition. So that's kind of what I do feel like in the future, once SP Hiragami is going to be out, the way you want to consider the cooldown is going to be slightly different. Another example I can also give you guys is going to be SP Konkegawa. SP Konkegawa, when you play him alongside with Tsuki, he can also reduce Tsuki's block cooldown by 2. And now if you actually consider, let's say if you have both SP Hiragami and also SP Konkegawa, what's going to happen is that if you actually have him in attack state, this is going to start off at 8 net crossing. Hiragami is going to reduce that down to 4 net crossing. Konkegawa is going to reduce that further down to 2 net crossing. So actually, in the future, once SP Hiragami is out and also SP Konkegawa is available, what you can actually do is that you can actually tweak your attack and defense state in a way where you can literally have Tsuki with only a block cooldown of 2 or a spike cooldown of 2. Well, you can even mix it up so that he have both his block and also spike always only at a cooldown 4 net crossing as well. So there's actually a lot of different variation you can play around with kind of this cooldown reduction. That will be very, very important for Tsuki in the future. But as of right now, without SP Hiragami's insane support on reducing cooldown, personally, I feel like attack state has a slight edge over block state, at least from the cooldown perspective. Okay. Now let's consider the second thing you want to look at, which is going to be this increase in buff. Now this to me is also going to be quite important, and the reason why this is going to be quite important is that you do actually want Tsuki to be somewhat consistently doing his critical block and also spike, especially if you have him as skill rating 4. That's going to be even more important because when he does a critical block, you are able to increase the power of that block even further. So outside of the fact that it's already a crit and therefore a higher number, you are also going to increase the base multiplier as well, and also apply in rage. And it's also going to be the same thing for spike as well. It's going to be unblockable and also going to be even stronger. So you do want your Tsuki to be somewhat consistently able to landing off those crits. Like even without skill rating 4, if you're able to make sure you crit every single block or every single spike, that's always going to be a stronger way of using him as well. Okay, so that's kind of why ideally you do want to do that. And Tsuki does actually have a way to get him to potentially reliably to crit on all of his actions, okay? And the reason why he can do this is that if you take a look at this, what this basically is able to offer is basically 50% increase in one of your critical stats. And then if we would take a look at the rest of his kit, what you don't realize is that for his skill 1, you are actually able to get a 15% buff in his awareness and reflex, provided there's a debuff, you're able to already get base 15%. And then if you actually consider his potential build, what's going to happen is that the main stats on slot 2 and slot 4, you can have it so that it's an increase of 20% awareness or 20% reflex there as well. So even at only skill level 1, if you actually have the right substats on your right main stats on your potential, that's already going to be a minimum 35% increase in his awareness or reflex. And then if you add in the random bits and bobs from your substats, etc., it's actually going to be quite plausible for you to have Tsuki already starting off with a base 50% crit rate in both awareness and also reflex. And then if you're also able to then add in another 50% through his skill 3, you can make sure at least one of your stats is already going to be almost consistently near 100%, and they're always guaranteed to crit, okay? And basically what that basically means is that if you can actually bring enough teammates on your team to buff up one of your attack, one of your awareness or one of your reflex stat, you can then actually basically choose the right state for Tsuki so that he actually crit every single action. So I'm going to give you guys an example, a very simple example. If you actually take a look at his bond, what you realize is that when he's actually playing with Hinata, what that basically means is that when Hinata does a crit, you are going to get another 50% of Hinata's awareness, up to 50%. And when Hinata does his crit based on his skill 3 effect, that's basically 100% awareness. And what that basically means is that this bond between Tsuki and the Hinata essentially is going to give Tsuki 50% awareness, okay? And what that basically means is that if you already start off Tsuki with 50 awareness and also 50 crit, and this bond is able to get Tsuki already to 100% awareness, at this point, if you then do Tsuki with a defense build, when Tsuki does a block, his reflex is now going to increase by 50% of his awareness, which is already going to become 100 because of this bond between Hinata and Tsuki. What then you end up doing is that Tsuki can essentially get 100% awareness and also 100% reflex whenever he performs a spike or block, okay? And that to me is very, very strong. And this is obviously going to be an example where you're able to buff up awareness, but the same thing can also be said, let's say, if you have a reflex buffer. So let's say if you have SP Kenma, or let's say if you have SP Kenma and also skill resonance 2 Sakusa as well, who are able to buff up reflex, etc. Or in the future, there's also Kong and Gawa. If you have already a way to, let's say, get 50% reflex from your teammates, what that basically means is that if you then do an attack build, you would end up having your Tsuki already with the natural 50% base reflex plus the 50% from your teammates, so already 100% reflex whenever he do his blocks. And then when he's actually attacking, his awareness will be increased by 50% of his reflex, which is 100. And what that basically means is that the base of 50% awareness on Tsuki is then going to add in another 50% awareness, which is scaled based on his 100% reflex, and then all of a sudden he's able to crit on all of his spikes as well, okay? So that's something for you guys to bear in mind. So I guess in simple terms is that if you actually want Tsuki to be in a way where he can consistently crit on both his blocks and also on his spikes, then what you can actually do is take a look at the rest of your teammate. Are they going to give more awareness or are they going to give more reflex? If they're going to give more awareness, then what you can do is you can then actually say, okay, in those cases, I don't need to buff up my awareness any further. So instead, I can actually do him a defense build to buff up his reflex instead. Or if your teammate is actually predominantly buffing up reflex rather than buffing up awareness, then what you can say is, okay, I don't need any more buff on reflex. Instead, I need a bit more help on my spikes, on my awareness instead, and then I'm actually going to change him into a attack state. So depending on which one your teammates buff up more, you can then change your state accordingly to make sure you actually do crits on both blocks and also ultimate. Okay, it sounds a bit complicated. I just kind of realized I said a lot of like 50%, 100%, etc. But hopefully you guys understood that. Okay, so that's basically another consideration for you guys to consider when putting when building Tsuki. So obviously with this consideration of both cooldown and also this consideration of teammates, which one do they actually buffer more? Is it awareness? Is it reflex? You are normally then able to choose build or a state for Tsuki, which is going to be the most beneficial or the most synergy with the rest of your team. And then once you decided on the build of your Tsuki to be either attack or defense, you can then slot in the last remaining members on your team to have your team of 7. Okay, so that's probably the way I personally would decide whether you want to go for attack state versus defense state on Tsuki. Okay, so I said a lot about his mechanics, and that's kind of why it's quite complicated. But now let's move on to the simple part, which is going to be the potential. So obviously on slot 6, you would either want to go for main stats, which is attack technique or defense technique, which will determine whether you are essentially going to go into attack state or defense state. Now, in terms of the set potential, what you're going to take a look at is going to be whether you want to do for it to be attack build or defense build. Remember what I said earlier, if your Tsuki is only at low resonance level, so for example on your base copy or maybe skill resonance 2, I would advise you build him in the way so that your attack state or defense state is lined up with your attack potential or defense potential. However, if your Tsuki is actually a skill resonance 4 or higher, then you can potentially mix it up, which is kind of the way I have right now. So for example, I actually have him at skill resonance 4. So even though I actually have my Tsuki at defense state, what you can see is that I actually have a 4-piece attack build on him so that I'm actually able to take advantage of that short cooldown. And in this case, what that basically means is that I'm able to spike a lot more unblockable spikes. Okay, so that's normally the way I would recommend for those who are skill resonance 4 or higher, but skill resonance at the lower skill resonance, then you try to align your attack or defense state alongside with your potential. Okay, now what exactly set do you actually want potential set? So if you're going to do a defensive potential set, what I would recommend is I will go for 4-piece forceful guard, and that's because this to me is actually going to be quite important for the increased reflex, which is also helpful because you do actually want your Tsuki to be roughly around the 50% base awareness and reflex no matter which build you are going for. And then the other thing is that you are able to increase the power of your block as well, which to me once again is also quite nice. The other block alternative ones that you're able to do is all somewhat annoying in the sense that they all have a condition. For example, this one is only when you're doing a power spike. This one is only when there's another front row blocker, etc. But that's kind of why in consideration I feel like this 4-piece effect is a lot easier to trigger. So if you're going for a defensive build, I would say go for 4-piece forceful guard and then 2-piece in any of the others. Or the other alternative is that because you want to go for defensive state, you want your reflex to increase by awareness and you don't have enough awareness buffers on your team, then the 2-piece you can actually go instead. It's going to be the one for this one, which basically have a 2-piece increase in awareness. So you can also do this for the 2-piece instead. Okay. Now, if you're going for 4-piece, if you're going for attack build on your potential, then the one I'm going to recommend is going to be Sharp Sense. So 4-piece Sharp Sense, because the reason why I recommend this one is that it's able to increase awareness to make sure you reach that 50% threshold a lot easier. And what that actually allows you to do is that if you already have this 15% awareness from this potential set, what you can potentially means is that you can actually have a lot more freedom or flexibility with the main stats on your slot 2. So normally, if you do not use this potential set, you potentially have to go for awareness main stat on slot 2, just so that you can get to that 50% base. However, because I am actually using the potential set, that essentially freed me up on slot 2. And instead, I can go for, ideally, you probably want strength. I just couldn't find one with strength. That's kind of why I'm using a quick attack main stats on slot 2 instead here. Okay. Now for the 2-piece that you want to on your potential for attacks build, normally you can either go for the other attacking one. For example, you can also go for this one if you want extra awareness. But normally, if you're already going for attack state, it's quite easy for you to get that awareness. So rather than actually increasing awareness like this, it's probably actually easier for you to increase reflex, which would then contribute to your awareness. So that's probably what I recommend for the 2-piece and also 2-piece here. Or alternatively, if you can already make sure you are going to max out on your reflex anyway, even though you're going for attack state, then what you can do is you have a 2-piece of rapid quick attack, because that will just improve your raw quick attack state. Okay, so that's normally what you want to do. Just to show you guys what I have right now, for example, and why I kind of stick with this is because if we actually take a look at my stats, what's the easier way to show my stat? So just to give you guys an example, I have my Tsuki right now at basically a base 25 awareness and base around 30 reflex. And because I already have my skill resonance, my skill 1 level 3, I'm going to get a natural 25% increase to awareness and reflex as well. So that essentially means my awareness right now is already pretty much sitting at that base of 50%. And because I play him alongside with SP Hinata, I can already make sure my awareness is always going to be, well, 99.8%. So essentially I'm going to crit every single action, right? And then because I have my defense technique higher than attack technique, this is actually a defensive build Tsuki. So what that basically means is that I have a natural state of 29% reflex. I'm going to get another 50 or 49.9% from my awareness whenever I do a block. So naturally this together is almost already 80% reflex. So I already have a very high chance of critting on all of my defensive action as well. At the same time, I also have SP Gamma, so it's quite easy for me to reach that 100% threshold for reflex towards kind of the middle of the match anyway. So that's kind of why I have chose to build my Tsuki this way, so that I can make sure I basically have the ability to consistently crit on all of my spikes and also on all of my blocks. Let's talk about the memory choices for SP Tsuki. So obviously his best memory is going to be his own signature one, because it improves both quick attack and also block at the same time. If you don't have this, then the other memory only focus on one of those two things, so you should decide which one you want to do. If you just want quick spike, then you can go for SP Hinata's memory, or if you just want to focus on the blocks, then you can use either Aone or Kuro's memory instead. Now if you don't have any of those SP memory, I need to use the SSRs. For the blocking one, you can go for Washio's one. It's not the best fit for Tsuki, but because it's the most universal SSR memory, so it's going to be quite useful long term in case you don't need to use this on any other character. So you can definitely go for this. Otherwise, if you want a better fit or better synergy with Tsuki, probably the best option is going to be Tendo's one. To be honest, you can also use this Kuro's one or Aone's one. They're both pretty good memories for mid blockers as well. So you can also use those for Tsuki. Aone's one is somewhat universal, and Kuro's one, it basically buff out both your offensive stats and also defensive stat at the same time, which is also kind of what you want to do if you want to go for a hybrid Tsuki. Okay, so either of those three can also work. And then if you want to go for quick spiking one, the best option is going to be this one for Suna. However, the free one that you're able to exchange from Match 3 store can also work. So if you really want to save resources, rather than spending memory ticket to get Suna's one, which is probably the best SSR attacking one for Tsuki, but instead you can go a bit more budget by getting this free one from the Match 3 store instead. Okay, so those are going to be the free-to-play alternative for SP Tsuki's memory. Alright, so that's basically going to be my guide for how to build SP Tsuki. Let me know what you're going to think of this and also how you are planning to build him.